Okay, well, hello everybody, and to those of us that are just joining us, I welcome you to our first Be Bold History webinar of, well, this school and academic year. We are happy to be joined by Professor Jonathan Phillips today, who's going to be talking a little bit and giving us an intro into sort of the life and legacy of sort of the Sultan Saladin. And I don't know how much of an intro we'll get in 40 minutes, but I'm ready for that whistle-stop tour. Just while we're waiting and while we sort of get our screen sorted and things like that, it would be amazing if you could just pop in the chat sort of how do you currently teach the Crusades, if at all, really. I know that for me, we were just saying that I touch on it in a couple of lessons in my department, but actually I'm not going into that much detail. So just while we're sort of waiting and for any people for us to join, it would be amazing if you could pop in the chat answering that question. How do you currently teach the Crusades in your classroom? Okay, Jonathan, if you wanted to share your PowerPoint.
Sure. Okay, has that come up?
Yeah, perfect. And then full screen, and that'll be amazing.
Should have gone to full screen. Yeah, okay.
Perfect. Over to you.
Great. Okay. Thanks ever so much for inviting me. Good evening, everybody, and thanks particularly to Harriet for extending this invitation. I think we had a slightly tortuous kind of arrangement of it, but with the sort of end of COVID and things like that. But it's nice to be doing this, and nice to be talking to you. What I'm going to do is, I'm not sure how much you know about Saladin. I'm just going to give a very, very sort of brief overview of the Crusades, and everything you need to about the Crusades in 2 minutes, just to sort of set a little bit of a framework for it. And then I'm going to run through his life. But I'm not going to just give you a narrative of his life, because you can get that from books. I want to try and identify the reasons why I think he was successful. And then after that, I'm going to talk briefly, although time is quite tight, about his memory in the West, which is something I'm actually doing some research on at the moment, and then how he's remembered in the Muslim Near East today, or in the last couple of centuries. So without further ado, I should start. So the First Crusade was called in 1095 by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont, and in this, Urban II asked the knights of Western Europe to go and liberate the Holy Sepulchre, as he saw it, from the hands of the Muslims. So you can see here the Holy Sepulchre here on the right. And this produced an extraordinary reaction. People were offered remission of their sins, a pardon, a heavenly pardon for the evil lives, the wicked lives that they led, and they all had been leading wicked lives. And knights and many others flocked to take the cross and travel after a very lengthy and difficult journey to get to Jerusalem, and in a bloodbath, which is quite important to note, killed the Muslim and Jewish defenders of Jerusalem in 1099 and returned Jerusalem to Christian hands. 88 years later, the Sultan Saladin managed to come to power, as I will tell you, and he got Jerusalem back for Islam. So there's an 88-year period when the Christians, the Crusader states as we call them, hold Jerusalem. And Saladin is the man who recovers it for Islam. And there you can see Jerusalem, of course, is the third most important site in the Muslim world. Mecca and Medina are 1 and 2. And here you see the Dome of the Rock, always used, I guess, in TV broadcasts. The place where the Prophet began his night journey to heaven is the third most important site in Islam. Just behind this, this is Temple Mount. The building on the left of the screen, as you look at it, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and just behind that is the Wailing Wall. So the most important site for the Jews. So you can see how physically close they all are, which I think, and actually right in the middle of the screen, you might be able to see a sort of grey blob, which is the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, just to show how proximate they are. So Saladin recovers the Dome of the Rock for Muslims. That prompts inevitably the Third Crusade, And here you can see Richard and Saladin have made their way to the Globe Theatre a few years ago, at one of the epics of medieval history. And this is effectively a 0-0 draw. Two great warriors, many great stories told about them, but in the end, Saladin holds on to Jerusalem. So just to say how I got into looking at this subject, I was in Damascus. I was fortunate enough to be in the wonderful city of Damascus in 2009, and wandering along, I saw this poster, which was a sign for Saladin, as you can see, dance theatre. Saladin the ballet. It was kind of a musical dance thing. And I went to see it. It wasn't perhaps quite my cup of tea, artistically speaking, but it was a very energetic, interesting push through the history down to the summer of 1187, when Saladin and his noble dancing warriors captured Jerusalem from the drunken Crusaders. And by the end of it, everybody's clapping along, enjoying themselves. People know this story. They knew exactly what was going to happen. And you can see, without thinking too hard, why it was put on in the theatre in Damascus, downtown Damascus, under the auspices of the Assad regime, because of course it represents the Arab people throwing out invaders, brackets, Israel. So you can see very directly the modern resonance of putting on this story about this great Arab hero with great links to Damascus and the ejection of an invading party. And this set me thinking as to what other memories and legacies of Saladin are there around. And fairly quickly, you can find a lot of them, as you can see on this slide. I'll talk about some of these in a bit more detail later. There was also an academic angle to this, because I'd read an article which said that until the Kaiser Wilhelm II's visit to Damascus in 1898, the Muslim Near East had forgotten about Saladin and really didn't use him very much, weren't very interested in his memory and legacy. And it took a speech from the Kaiser at a dinner after he laid this actual wreath on Saladin's tomb for the Muslim world to effectively go, gosh, yeah, we've got this great folk hero. Let's start employing his memory in propaganda and to draw us together to fight invaders. And frankly, I found this patronizing and implausible. The wreath, by the way, is in the Imperial War Museum. Lawrence of Arabia nicked it a couple of years, about 20 years later. But the idea that the Muslim world had forgotten Saladin, I just, not in any sort of profound way, it's just nonsense. And so I sort of made it my business to see if this was true, and if you could discern the memory and the legacy after he died in the period effectively between the 13th and the 19th century. And as I'll show you fairly briefly later on, although I did a lot of research on it and wrote quite a lot about it, the short answer is he was not forgotten in the Muslim Near East. This idea that the Kaiser reminded the Muslim Near East is just wrong. So let's sort of set the scene, because when I'm teaching, I have to say I love maps. My grandfather was a cartographer, and that's obviously stuck with me. And so this is really the area that we're looking at, not just the Holy Land, but a much broader sweep of the Near East. And Saladin was born in Tikrit, which you might know is where Saddam Hussein was born, so kind of center right, Tikrit on the river Tigris, just north of Baghdad. Born in about 1137-8 to a Kurdish family, and that's quite interesting. So he's ethnically Kurdish. But when he is growing up, the most important figure in his I suppose his formative years is a man called Zengi, who was a brutal Turkic warrior, who was the first Muslim ruler to start beginning to take the fight to the Crusaders. In 1099, when the First Crusade invaded the Holy Land, the Muslim Near East was really fragmented. The Sunni and the Shia, of course, were split as they still are today. But within the Sunni Near East, there was an awful lot of division. Perhaps 5 years earlier, the Sunni world was quite united. There was some very powerful Seljuk Sultan and viziers around, but they died, or various reasons. And so the First Crusade benefited from the fact the Muslim Near East was really fragmented, crucial to its success. In the course of the 12th century, the Muslim world begins to pull itself together. This man Zengi is a rather brutal warlord, and the man whose tomb you see on the screen now, his son Nur al-Din, really took the counter-crusade, the anti-Frankish jihad, the Muslim holy war, to the Crusaders. And this is Zengi's tomb in Damascus. I always think this is a rather sad photograph. You've got to peer through a little grill, which is often shut. This rolled up carpet in the corner, the kind of hose pipes. It's not on the tourist trail, this one. But actually Nur al-Din may not have disapproved. He's in a madrasa. He's in a teaching college that he founded. And that gives you a clue as to his character, because he was a devout man and a great warrior. And his energy, his physical energy and his intellectual energy in pushing forward the counter-crusade means that he's really the first person to take the fight to the Crusaders with some success. This is actually one of his own Qurans, which survives to this day. He also did a lot of sort of civic work for his people, bathhouses, top left, a hospital, top center, and lots of sort of sermons and speeches in the wonderful Great Umayyad Mosque you can see in the other pictures. So it's in this environment, Nur al-Din creating a military and, if you like, an intellectual environment for the counter-crusade against the Franks, as we call them, that Saladin grew up in Damascus. And as you move through, we're now in sort of the 1160s, 70s, the great battleground against the Crusaders was Egypt. So bottom left on your screens. And Egypt is interesting because it was ruled by a Shia dynasty. So the Sunnis are fighting the Shia. No change there, perhaps. And the Crusaders in Jerusalem are also after Egypt. So the Syrian Sunnis and the Christian Franks are both trying to conquer Egypt in the bottom left. It's a competition. The Shia regime there is ruling over a very wealthy country, but as a regime, they've disintegrated. They really have lost structure. And so there's this great tempting target of the wealth of Egypt just waiting. You can see the fertility of the Nile there. And great sort of storehouses and treasure houses. It's on so many trade routes, gold from West Africa, spice trade. Alexandria, sort of the top left of the Nile Delta there, really is the best port in the Mediterranean by a huge margin. So Egypt is what you want. And there's a number of battles and invasions of Egypt in the 1160s, led by Nur ad-Din's general, a man called Shirkuh, who happens to be Saladin's uncle. And Shirkuh is a little fat man with one eye, almost sort of one very badly damaged eye. And he leads the Sunni Syrian Muslims to victory in January 1169. And about 8 weeks later, he dies of overeating. He sort of explodes. So didn't get to enjoy his hard-fought success. And that leaves Saladin to take over. And I have to say, this is a bit of the story that I really, when I was writing my book on him, really excited me. The idea of this youngish man, late 20s, early 30s, not with much of a career that we know about to date, nothing sort of powerfully in terms of leadership. And he's there as a Kurd in a Sunni Syrian invasion force of a Shia country, with facing, of course, the remnants of the regime, the Crusaders trying to get to him, other people in Africa from, say, the Sudan or Ethiopia trying to get to him, the Greeks, anyone and everyone. And of course, he's got to deal with his master Nur al-Din in Damascus. And I thought, wow, what a challenge that faced him there. And 18 years later, he's able to take back Jerusalem. So a real very steep arc is what I wanted to explore. So how did he do it without sort of telling you the story in a kind of endlessly narrative way? Well, we have quite a lot of information about Saladin. It's one of the challenges of teaching him, I suppose, and writing about him. There's a couple of his administrators wrote wonderful stories, lives of Saladin, accounts of his life and his victories. The catch is, they could be seen to be too good to be true. There's a genre called Mirrors for Princes, ideal books on how princes and rulers should behave. And Saladin, almost alarmingly at times, seems to tick all the boxes. So there's a kind of worry that these lives of Saladin, or the accounts of his career, are almost sort of literary confections designed to sort of fill him in and make him look great. So there's a question there. There are other Muslim sources we can look at, and there's an interesting traveler, a Spanish Muslim pilgrim who goes through Saladin's lands and then goes home. So of course he can write whatever he likes, and he praises Saladin for a number of virtues. There's some more hostile Muslim writers who again do say positive things about his character and his actions. And there's also, of course, the Franks, the Christians. What did they say? The pictures on the screen you can see now are images connected with a man called William of Tyre, who's the great historian of the Crusader states in the 12th century. And he wrote before the fall of Jerusalem, and he said that Saladin was wise in counsel, valiant in war, and generous beyond measure. And for that reason in particular, he was to be feared by our men. So you have from the pen, as it were, of somebody who is an enemy of Saladin, quite a positive and interesting appraisal. Wise in counsel, I'll come back to that in a minute. Valiant in war, not sure he was the greatest general, and generous beyond measure. And that's his big danger, if you like, posed through his generosity. And of course, many rulers are generous. When people come to the throne, they're generous. They give things away, like tax breaks. Sorry, just to be topical. But in Saladin's case, generosity is clearly a personality trait. His biographers say that money had to be hidden from him because he would give it away. He's personally quite austere. He doesn't go around demonstrating his wealth. He gives it away. And of course, it's an effective way of rewarding supporters. And here you have robes of honor. He's always giving away robes of honor and land. And of course, these aren't just gifts for the sake of it. He expects something in return. He's expecting your loyalty, your support, and your adherence to his cause. So don't mistake this, but it is done in a compulsive way. It is done in a very competitive way, actually. Richard the Lionheart gives him some gifts in the Third Crusade, and he has to give something bigger and better. He doesn't ever want to be outdone in giving gifts. And he gives gifts to people like holy men. And here you can see some preachers. And of course, that means that they will pray for him, which is always helpful to have some religious backing, as it were. It also means that the Sunnis are able to extend their rule into formerly Shia-controlled Egypt, which allows him to be very much at the sharp end of the Sunni holy war, and a champion of Sunni orthodoxy, if you may. It's always important to have the religious classes on your side. He also employs and gives lots of money and land to his Kurdish family. His family really sticks with him, and that's very important. You look at contemporaries, lots of ruling families. Let's look at Henry II of England, almost the same time. So I'm sure you're aware the boys are generally pretty badly behaved, and he has to deal with, poor old Henry, lots of revolts. Saladin's family stick with him 99% of the time. They can see he is a great front of house, he is a great leader, he's charismatic, he's diplomatic, he rewards them, and generally he manages them very well. The other part of his household I want to tell you about are actually the secretariat and the administrators. They are brilliant. He has a very, very high-end team of administrators around him. He picks the best and he doesn't take no for an answer. So he's a very loyal group of people around him. And that again is coherence, it's good messaging. He's brilliant at they are brilliant at letter writing. Effectively, they control social media in the 12th century. I don't say that flippantly. They really are always putting out messages about him and how successful he is and how important his work is and why you should back him. But it's not all holy war, because again, it was very interesting to explore this gift giving earlier. And he has a court around him, and Saladin is very, very obsessed with poetry. And he, as a good a Muslim ruler at the time should be, a thing called adab, means you should be cultured, and amongst other things. And so he sponsors poetry competitions. And what you see here on the screen, believe it or not, is a poem, as is that. And as is that. He has some interestingly creative poets around him. This is actually another Spanish Muslim poet and called Al-Jilani. And this is in reality about 2.5 meters long. So you'd have to stand on a table, I suppose. And you, the audience, would have to fill in some of the words. It's a kind of call and response thing. So you can see the creativity around Saladin. It was interesting to get away from, if you like, the narrative of conquest and holy war, to look at some of the other things that he's interested in and what motivates him. He also likes playing polo a lot. That's another strong part of his personality, and he loves hunting. These, I suppose, are part of his equestrian upbringing, and they're also good practice for war, coordination of horses and fighting. But moving the narrative along just loosely, in 1169, I told you he took control of Egypt. For the next 5 years, he consolidates his family's position there. He very much feathers the Ayyubids, as his family is called, very much feathers their nest, putting them in positions of power, getting control of the wealth of Egypt. And this does hugely worry and annoy his patron, Nur al-Din, in Damascus. And he is asked to come and help fight the Crusaders, and he kind of, oh, there's trouble at home, it would be dangerous for me to do it, better not, sorry. And he really, really irritates Nur al-Din, who actually in early 1174 gets an army together, and there's about to be a civil war between Saladin and Nur al-Din. And Nur al-Din dies of natural causes. So Saladin is very lucky on a lot of occasions, and this really is one of them. And so the death of Nur al-Din in the middle of 1174 is a real stroke of luck. And from then, Saladin spends the next 13 years, if you look at the map, he's got Egypt. He then fairly quickly goes to Damascus, where he's quite well known, marries Nur al-Din's widow, and then spends a long time trying to reconstitute Nur al-Din's Syrian empire by taking Aleppo and eventually Mosul over to the east. And it's interesting, between 1174 and 87, he spends a lot of time fighting his fellow Sunni Muslims. So you might say Saladin is the hero of Islam, and you'd be right. If you said he was a usurper, you'd also be right. And I think he wouldn't have seen that as well, he did have to defend himself against those accusations. That's where a lot of his spin doctors come in, because of course he's usurping the lands of his former master's son, Nur al-Din's son. But he argues that he is the best man to take the fight against the Franks, that he never sort of swerves in that. He's the champion of Sunni orthodoxy. They should work together. But really, he's an ambitious empire builder. And I don't think that's particularly mutually exclusive to kicking the Crusaders out. He is working hard to reconstitute that empire as he would see it and create his own in order to have the strength to kick the Crusaders out. But it's an interesting tension. You can have him definitely as the champion of Islam and as a usurper. Nur al-Din was a usurper. It's kind of just what people do. So he takes the fight to the Franks, to the Crusaders. There's a battle in 1177 called Montgisard, where he is really badly beaten. He has more of a success here. I know I've got to be careful with the time, and I know this is a rather anonymous looking slide, but I hope you can see a kind of shape in the center of the screen there with a bit of a wall at the left. If you were to drop behind where that green bit in the middle is, you would find the River Jordan. So this is right on what was effectively the border between Christian and Muslim lands. In fact, just over that hill to the back is Syria. And in fact, this photograph was taken in a minefield, but a friend of mine was the chief archaeologist who assured me that they'd been working there for 10 years and it was quite safe, although the locals did look a bit worried. So don't do that at home, folks. But this castle was built by the Franks to threaten Saladin, to threaten Damascus, and he was able to take it in 1179. It's an amazing treasure trove of archaeological resources, which I can talk about later. And by early 1187, he'd drawn the Muslim Near East together. He's got the wealth of Egypt. He's got the strength and the intellectual power of Damascus. He's got Aleppo. He's got Mosul, and he's got dragged together this fragile coalition. And he takes the Crusaders on. He brings them to battle at the Horns of Hattin, and you can see them horns behind this gentleman here, and you can see how dry it was. And the battle takes place in the summer of 1187, and Saladin has superior resources and organization. He manages to bluff the Crusaders into trying to march across 30 kilometers of this kind of landscape in early July with no water. It's not clever. And he's got so much water, he can pour water out in front of the Crusaders, which must have been excruciating. And he basically grinds them into submission. And they have a last stand on top of the hill you can see in the background. And the true cross, the great Crusader talisman, is captured again, made its way to the globe, as is the King of Jerusalem on the right here, and Reynald of Chatillon, who is always the walk-on baddie in all Crusader movies. He's the walk-on baddie in Kingdom of Heaven, and he is executed by Saladin. This leaves Jerusalem open to him, and in early October 1187, he's able to reclaim the holy city for Islam. And Rosewater purifies the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, and he recovers it. But interestingly, he recovers it by negotiation. He besieges it, and rather than slaughtering the defenders, as the Crusaders did to the Muslims and Jews in 1099, Saladin negotiates. He threatens them, but he negotiates a ransom. And that's an interesting act of mercy, which of course is a form of power at a time that he's really driven a stake through the heart of Christendom. He shows mercy. And so I think that's an interesting notion that he's set up there. Of course, with the capture of Jerusalem, his spin doctors go full throttle, and they're able to say, well, you may have doubted us, you may have said he was a usurper. Look, no other family has achieved this. He has done what others tried and failed to do. God has approved of his actions. We have Jerusalem back. So next question, please. So this is Saladin receiving the ransoms. And then we move on to the Third Crusade. The Pope is said to have died of a heart attack when he heard the news. Excuse me. And Western Europe quite slowly girds itself to take on the Muslim Near East. And here you see the city of Acre, or Akko as it is in northern Israel. Fabulous medieval cities you can see from that beautifully organized street plan there. And there's an almost 2-year siege, an epic, described by contemporaries as comparable with Troy. And in it, endless sort of suffering, endless engagements and battles. And by the summer of 1191, Richard the Lionheart finally arrives, and that tips the balance. And it enables the Crusaders to break into Acre, to capture the Muslims there, and to render Saladin quite a serious defeat. Over the next year or so, Richard and Saladin are fighting, they're skirmishing, they're engaging in an awful lot of diplomacy as well in the effort of the Crusaders to besiege Jerusalem. But in short, they never managed to. This is the part of the story of the Third Crusade, which is actually what I'm going to be working on next. And in the end, Richard never manages to besiege Jerusalem, and he has to go home. They make a treaty in the late summer of 1192, and he returns home, having captured several cities on the coast, but not Jerusalem. And funny enough, in March 1193, funny enough, I meant as in only a few months later, Saladin dies, worn out, I think, by decades of struggle. He'd had ill health for many years. That's another interesting thing to engage with, his physical and his mental health, which we have some evidence for. He really did suffer for years with ill health. But he dies in March 1193. So I think he could probably look back on the Third Crusade and say, well, Western Europe sent its Emperor of Germany, King of France, King of England. The Emperor of Germany's dead. The other two have gone home. I've still got Jerusalem. I may have lost some cities on the coast, but ultimately I have regained and held Jerusalem for Islam. Okay, short section next, Saladin's memory in the West, which actually I've just written quite a long article on, which was interesting to research. But I have to tell you in about 3 minutes. So Western Europe knew a bit about him before the Battle of Hattin. He's not an unfamiliar figure before the fall of Jerusalem. Some people have got positive views of him, some less so. But of course, after he's taken Jerusalem, he really is the son of Satan. And this wonderful creature is the seven-headed beast of the apocalypse. And if you look at head number 6, you'll see one with a little golden crown and the word Saladinus, I think, written above it. And that, of course, is Saladin. So he's so bad, he's one of the 7 heads of the beast of the apocalypse. And Western Europe is very, very negative on him. Yet within a few years, his reputation is transformed. And actually, I would say that his reputation is transformed in the last 4 months of the siege of Acre. because the Crusaders, the Westerners, having had all these terribly negative images, suddenly start spending a lot more time with him or in his company. Well, not Richard and Saladin never meet, but Richard spends a lot of time with Saladin's brother Saladin, and I think there's a blur, Saladin blur. But they've seen a lot of him over the last couple of years. There's a lot of Western European writers on the Crusade, and they see somebody who is merciful, particularly to women, who is generous, who is pious, who is a brave warrior, and in other words, somebody who has all the virtues that they, as Western European knights, with chivalry really as one of the great cultural drivers in Western Europe at the time, he is an almost, because he's Muslim, almost perfect chivalric knight. And so they recognize, admire, he is winning, remember, in many respects, this figure. So his reputation changes. And right at the end of the Crusade, a group of people, including the man who's about to become the Archbishop of Canterbury when he gets home, goes to Jerusalem. Saladin welcomes them. He's everything that you expect him to be. He's generous, he's courteous, he guards them, he indulges them in clever conversation. And so his reputation changes, not with everybody, but generally quite quickly. And by the early 13th century, he's got a sort of literary reputation. He is said to have been, in fact, able to disguise, some of these stories get obviously completely ridiculous. He's seen so positively, he can disguise himself and come to the West, seducing Western women. He, in fact, auto-baptized himself on his deathbed with the people around him, not noticing that he'd become a Christian on his deathbed. Absolute drivel, of course. But people are starting to weave him comfortably, not the son of Satan here, but weave him rather more comfortably with this sort of chivalric figure. I'm sure some of you recognize the Ladybird book, this sophisticated, cultured figure into their stories. Other things he's used as a sort of benchmark for generosity in satirical poems to Western political figures. Some people start calling their kids Saladin. I mean, unless you really didn't want the child or despised it, you wouldn't do that. So in a sense, it's an interesting reflection. Down the centuries, his austerity is admired and picked up upon. The fact that when he died, he had almost no money at all. And you see sermons in the 16th, 17th century invoking Saladin, of all people, for his austerity and the transience of worldly wealth, and the fact that he succeeded, even though he succeeded without worldly wealth, personal worldly wealth. And just slightly more flippantly, by the time you get to the 20th century, things like the Royal Navy, you've got HMS Saladin, you've got the Saladin armoured car. Again, I suppose these are sort of general positive signifiers. But last section, the Muslim Near East. Excuse me, just having a drink. How is he viewed in the Muslim Near East? Was he forgotten? Well, as soon as he dies, he's got a succession issue. Not the one that faces many Western rulers of having a son. He's got 17 of them, which is problematic in its own way. He had one wife who he was very devoted to, actually, and wrote to her when he thought he was dying a few years in 1186. And so they had a sort of clearly a strong relationship. He had a couple of concubines by whom he had 2 or 3 other children each in those cases, with a grand total of 17. But a couple of the lads start fighting fairly quickly, and his empire fragments. And actually, by 1260, his empire is finished. But as you start looking through the histories, the poetry, the travel documents, the jihad treaties, you can find plenty of evidence down the centuries of endless positive references to Saladin, his achievements, his piety, and also things like his governing ability. It's not all about fighting Westerners. There's a text from Istanbul from the Ottoman era, which talks about books of history being overflowing with stories about this man. And as a historian, seeing that phrase, books of history overflowing, was just like, yes. In other words, the writer is saying there's almost so many of these that I kind of don't need to tell you about it, but thank God he did. And Saladin is admired for his good government, so his justice. So it's not just fighting Westerners. He's a man to be admired. And of course, once you start looking at many of these references down the century, particularly when you get to the 18th, 19th century, you can, of course, you're talking about the uses of memory, which is an interesting thing to research and an interesting thing to teach. Why do you, in, say, this gentleman on the right here, his name escapes me, Al-Jabati, I think, writing in Egypt early in the 19th century, why do you invoke Saladin's memory? And on the left, you've got Napoleon, 1798, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And that really is the game changer. It's Western Europe starting to get back into the Eastern Mediterranean, the ages of colonialism, imperialism, and trying to dominate the Muslim lands of the Mediterranean. And I suppose, to give an example of why Saladin and the Crusades more broadly are remembered, there's a writer called Nicholas the Turk. And he said, oh, the French, well, we don't like them. We've never liked them, in fact. We don't like their language. We don't like their clothes. We don't like their religion. And the last time they came here, we captured their king and thrashed them. And actually, Nicholas the Turk in 1802 is talking about Louis IX in 1250. So this writer has gone straight back to the 13th century in the early 19th century. And in the interim period, whenever Westerners looked like they were threatening the Holy Land, oh, it's the Crusades again. So you can find many examples of that in the text. So the Crusades weren't forgotten. And of course, Saladin is invoked as the man who drew the Muslim Near East together and threw the Westerners out. So he is a man who is attractive to be emulated, but also, of course, because he's a good ruler. So people want to identify with him in both of those instances. He's also, as I'm going to show, can be molded, adapted by many, many different groups. So this is just the last, I might watch the last 5 minutes. So late 19th century, the sort of evidence trail appears much more strongly. Newspapers, 1868, an very early Lebanese newspaper serializes the 13th century life of Saladin. Newspaper proprietors don't serialize stuff their readers are not interested in. So I think that's a good example from the 1860s of a wider interest in the life of Saladin. There are plays written, history books and encyclopedias start being produced. These plays are very widely performed, and also ideas like Arab nationalism start coming to the fore, or nationalism more generally. What you see in front of you is an example of Kurdish nationalism. This is 1913, the first issue of the Daily Kurd. Of course you knew that. And who's the man on the cover? Of course, it's Saladin, the most famous Kurd in history. The end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire starts breaking up, and there's this document called the First Call, as the Syrians try and rally and throw the French out. And you can see there, they are rebelling against the colonizing powers, and it's the spirit of Saladin they're trying to invoke to do that. This is General Henri Duvo, who is infamously said to have gone up to Saladin's tomb in 1920 and kicked it, a sign of great disdain and disrespect for the hero of the Muslim Near East, and said, Saladin, this represents the triumph of the cross over the Crescent. We have returned. Now, whether he said that or not actually is irrelevant, because it was repeated in texts, Islamist texts, in Arab nationalist texts, in poems, in speeches by people like Nasser, and it's in Syrian school books to this day. So this representation of Western disdain for the people of the Near East and of Saladin himself through this act is quite manifest. Arab nationalism really comes on strong in the 1960s and late 50s as well. And you have the project by Nasser to unite Egypt and Syria. Well, who did that in the past? That'll be Saladin, of course. And you can see Nasser in the middle, with to his left, your right, the man with his head back is the president of Syria. And just over Nasser's right shoulder is Sadat, his successor. And they are at Saladin's tomb in Damascus. If you have 3 hours of your life, on Netflix is El Nasser Salahaddin, Saladin the Victorious, Yusuf Shaheen's fabulous 1963 movie. If you want to learn about Arab nationalism, this is a party political broadcast by Arab nationalists. It's astonishing. There's a lot of fighting, shouting. It is subtitled. There's some terrible prosthetics, but the message is that Saladin is the man who has drawn the Near East together, and he says to Richard, "Go home in peace. Tell your people this land is ours. They are welcome to visit it, but you started this war. We didn't want it. This is our land." So the idea of Arab nationalism is absolutely core to this movie. Other leaders who've embraced Saladin, Arab nationalist leaders, Assad in Syria. This is Assad Senior, and you can see this big image of the Battle of Hattin behind him. Saddam Hussein, very ironic, of course, given his hideous treatment of tens of thousands of Kurds, strongly identified with Saladin because they were born in the same place. And here you see a wonderfully low-level piece of source material, a bath mat, I think it is, which is great because it shows how deeply diffused these images are. It's not some grand statue or anything. This is tact, and that actually is really interesting to see. Saladin's tanks rolling to victory, Saladin's horsemen. On a sort of sharper tack, the first intifada, you can see the bush we say Saladin is waiting. I think that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque being carried on the left of the screen. And Osama Bin Laden, of course, Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden wrote a lot about Crusaders. He provoked, after the horrors of 9/11, George W. Bush into the fateful statement that this crusade, this war on terror, is going to take a while. And for Bin Laden, who was a great propagandist, this was a gift. He said, "I've been trying to tell you this for years and you wouldn't believe me." Well, he's just said it, hasn't he? He also wrote a poem about Saladin, rather eerily, Saladin coming out of the clouds, very eerie, of course, if you think about 9/11. So he talked about him a bit. Al-Zawahiri, I think, who was the man who was killed fairly recently, used a lot more history, actually, in his justification of Al-Qaeda's actions. He would talk about Nur al-Din as well, so some quite detailed stuff. So here we are with Bin Laden. Erdogan in Turkey, again, interesting to think about Turkish-Kurdish tensions, quite an important figure there. But it's not, I want to just finish on the note that it's not all political or religious leaders who invoke Saladin's memory. If you go particularly to Egypt, Syria, Palestine, you will see him in books, in plays, in TV series, TV documentaries, Ramadan television, multi-part TV dramas. He's there as a figure of deeply culturally embedded in the region. And he's there as a man, yes, who does draw people together, resist invaders and manage to eject them. But he's also there as a man who is a good ruler, somebody to admire. And this Malaysian cartoon, which is on YouTube, is Saladin. It's aimed at young boys. Saladin, the man you'll want as your friend. He's brave, he's funny, he's the man you'll always want in your corner. I didn't find him very funny, I have to say. Man of much to admire, but human, not necessarily. But it's interesting, he's there being drawn out, and one of the many different people who've used him down the centuries. So just to round that point off and to come to a conclusion, I was in Detroit a few years ago, and at the end of a talk, a young woman came up to me and she said, "I'm from Hama, the Syrian city of Hama. I'm a refugee from the Civil War. And you need to know that Saladin was the screensaver on all our mobile phones there." And that is, I thought, an absolute gem, because it's modern, it's mundane, and it just shows the resonance and Saladin for those people as a symbol of hope. So I hope that was of some interest to you. Thanks.
Okay, I don't know about you. I'll give you some time to sort of catch your breath and have a drink. But I've got two questions. But if there is anybody who's currently watching that has any questions themselves, or Harriet, if you have any questions to ask Jonathan. But if anyone has a question, if you can pop it in the chat, and then I will ask those, or Harriet will ask those to Jonathan. I suppose I could sort of kick it off with my question then. So I suppose I've got sort of two, and I guess they kind of link together. So the first one, although I feel like you've kind of answered it, is do you feel like there are different parts of sort of Saladin and his ruling and his diplomacy that are sort of evoked at different times in history based on kind of what is going on politically, or kind of, so for example, you gave the example of in 1868 with that sort of Lebanese newspaper. Is that kind of, are there different parts of Saladin that are evoked?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In a sense, it's sort of asking the question, why, the past is usually invoked for presentist reasons. Assad, Saddam Hussein, Bin Laden, they all want to take bits of Saladin and identify with it. They want him there as the exemplar. They want to use him to inspire people to be emulated, in a sense, to reflect his qualities of, say, success or good leadership. So it's interesting when you teach this is to then line up all those people from Bin Laden all the way across, to a cartoon, to Arab nationalism, to entertainment in the 19th century, to then back in the earlier centuries too. Stuff I didn't have the detail to go into, which is sort of less visual, if you see what I mean. It's much more textual. And, you are invoking his memory for presentist reasons, but he's incredibly malleable because, as I said, Saddam Hussein killed tens of thousands of Kurds, yet he's prepared to identify with Saladin. Apparently he changed his year of his birth to sort of coincide with Saladin's 37. So they were both born in 37 and things like that. And that's a sort of more extreme stuff. People like Gaddafi, I could have talked about as well. So it's you want something from the past when you invoke it. And in his case, it seems that he is somebody whom almost anybody can invoke, and not least one back in the West as well. People look to him. The sermons in the 17th century: be more like Saladin, avoid worldly wealth. So he's compelling in that sense.
I guess that kind of then leads me on to my second question. I guess it's, I don't know if it's sort of a bit controversial, but do you feel like there's sort of like a myth of Saladin in a way, like he's sort of grown to become this figure that, I guess if you take the example of that lady who was a refugee at the end, do you think there's like a spirit and sort of a myth of Saladin in a way for in the East? That, do you think that exists in the West as well, or there's a similar figure? What do you think?
Well, no, and I think it's obviously he's much more prominent in the East as a figure. In the Arab world and the Muslim world. The Arab nationalist film, by the way, is very much Christians and Arabs, Christians and Muslims acting together as Arabs. That's the key message of the Shaheen film from the 60s. Yes, I mean there is a myth, and as a historian, when I wrote the sort of medieval section of the book, I hinted at the problem of writing about Saladin in his own lifetime, if you like, is the fact that he's got these fabulous spin doctors. So is trying to sort of unpick that. But in some ways, when you're looking at the later years, whether he did or didn't do certain things becomes irrelevant. It's actually then looking at who's invoking his memory and the purposes for which he's being used. You don't go, oh, well, actually, you can't evoke him because he didn't really do that thing. The point, like I said, almost in a sense about the Guru kicking Saladin's tomb, that's irrelevant whether he said it or not. The point is, it's a representation of Western dismissal of our great hero and our people. So let's fix on it and use it and put him, of course, as the man who ultimately succeeded against it.
We do have a couple of questions, well, just one question and one sort of comment in the chat. So first of all, Joel says, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. Your work on the way Saladin's memory has invoked and interpreted in different ways and is ripe for secondary school level inquiry on historical interpretations. This probably feeds into the sort of CPD day that you held in the summer, Jonathan. So Joel says, have you worked with any secondary teachers on this? And do you have any thoughts on how your work could be brought into the classroom?
No, thanks, Joel. That's an interesting question. I have done some work with a teacher called Beth Gandy in London about looking at materials for Key Stage 3, or she, to be quite clear, she did all the work. And that's so yes, we are. I have thought about that, and Beth particularly has done this. And in a sense, when I talk to teachers, I do get the impression that it can be worked up. So I think it is something that I will do some more work on a little bit down the line with some of the teachers who I'm engaged with. But that's nice to, thank you for saying that, and in a sense seeing how it can be used. In a sense, it's, I mean, obviously medieval history gets a limited stretch in the school curriculum, but in one way, if I'm interpreting you right, you're sort of saying you can use this figure outside of a sort of straight medieval period and use him as a device, if you like, or a vehicle to talk about interpretation.
Yeah, I think potentially you could have, I don't know, just sort of thinking out loud here, you could have maybe an inquiry and learn about Saladin in a medieval lens, and then potentially you could have something about memory and how he's remembered, perhaps reworked into a later curriculum, perhaps within the modern world. So something where you perhaps revisit that sort of strand of knowledge in year 9 learning, that could potentially work. Right, the next thing in the chat is person says, no question, but a huge thanks for a mesmerizing talk. Could listen for hours, and they agree that they love a map too.
Good. It's amazing how many people's geography is not as great as you might believe it, if you see what I mean. So it's yeah, maps are totally essential. Yeah,
provide lots of context for where sort of things are happening, and you sort of build that sort of picture into those places, I think.
Yeah.
Right, this is the time if anyone else has got any other questions. If not, then I think we will leave it there, I believe.
Great. No, Joel, thank you for your point. I mean, actually, I'll think further about that. I hadn't, you know, I mean, Beth's work, Beth Gandy's work had sort of touched upon those things for sure, but it would be worth exploring that further. I know she's willing to share it, and I think we will do, and with the HA probably. So I think it will make its way out there.
Yeah, I think for me, I was thinking about because one of the components for the national curriculum for interpretations is to understand sort of how and why they've changed over time. So
right.
I sort of asked that question about sort of was things evoked at specific times, to think about sort of why does Saladin's kind of memory or interpretations of him evolve based on what's going on around.
Yeah, I should have said one thing. There's one group that do loathe him now, and that's the Shia. He does not have a good reputation at all in modern Shia world, because in 1171, I said he took control of Egypt. The young Fatimid Caliph died in Saladin's tender care of natural causes, ladies and gentlemen, obviously. And that dynasty is then removed. That is the end of a Shia caliphate. Yeah. And so, interestingly, contemporary Shia historians are not massively critical. Egypt in the 1150s, 60s, we're in danger of thinking of sort of, you know, black and white, A and B, Sunni Shia. And the regime in Egypt, if you don't mind me rambling on for a minute or two, has got very sort of porous. There are rituals that Sunni and Shia can go to, religious events and festivals that they've managed to work together, sort of formulas of activity that both groups are happy with. And places like Alexandria are Sunni dominant. So it's not just because you have a Shia caliph in Cairo, it doesn't mean that everybody in Egypt is a Shia who hates all Sunnis. It seems that there's an awful lot of cooperation and, as I say, sort of porosity in this thing. And in fact, when they start invoking the Sunni caliph's name in the Friday prayers, you would expect there to be uproar, but there's not. It actually moves over as a transition very, very easily. But in the 20th century, with the strong sectarian tension between the Sunni and the Shia, you find some Shia historians have written history saying Saladin's a traitor, he betrayed the Muslim world, you know, he's very bad, very wicked. So that's one group who, if you're adding to your interpretations, you need to be quite clear. He's not universally loved, let's put it like that, in the Muslim world. The Shia really, well, a number of Shia, I'm not saying, of course, every Shia, because again, it's a gormless statement, are quite negative on him. And they're doing that in the context of the Sunni Shia struggles we see in the last 40, 50 years.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.